All right. Good morning, evening, afternoon, everybody. Hopefully, can you see my slides here, Dan?
Yeah,
So,
see him fine.
okay.
Yeah.
So, just want to talk about the AGL roadmap and give a UCB update here. Um, really have three topics here on the agenda. First, I wanted to talk about the AGL steering committee and the priorities that the steering committee set for 2021. And I know a lot of you were involved at the expert group level in developing the individual feature lists. I'll just talk about the process we used and what the outcome was, and then kind of lead into some thoughts on the car of the future and how the existing roadmap leads us to the car of the future and what that might look like. And then finally, I wanted to give an update on the product ready IVI expert group. So it's a little different than my usual roadmap updates. I'm hopefully not going to be droning on and on about each of the expert groups and features and whatnot. So just a brief reminder of how AGL is structured. We have an advisory board, which consists of our gold and platinum members and some elected silver level members. The advisory board has delegated a lot of the technical steering oversight to the AGL steering committee. And then there's the system architecture team, which meets. So the steering committee meets about once a month. The system architecture team meets about every other week. And then there's various expert groups that we have that have been running. Some have been running for quite a long time, and we'll talk about some of those and some of the newer ones that we've created in the last year or two. Like I said, the advisory board includes all of the gold and platinum members plus elected silver members. These are typically executives and senior management level people. They meet about every quarter, and they're responsible for the strategy and overall direction of the project and the budget. So the steering committee consists of members of the advisory board companies, more technically oriented members of those companies. The steering committee meets monthly, sometimes more often than monthly, especially in the early part of the year as we're going through the roadmap and the priorities for the upcoming year. And they're in charge of prioritizing the overall technical roadmap and project direction, as well as allocating any development funds that the advisory board has allocated, and deciding how to spend that funding based on the roadmap priorities. So many of you may have been involved with this. At the beginning of the year, we asked each of the expert groups to compile a feature list for the upcoming roadmap. Looking out not just this year but the next few years. Had each of the expert groups as well as the system architecture team then prioritize their individual lists. Then the steering committee reviewed that rolled up list, all these features. I think we had 170 or 180 features. Steering committee then reviewed that rolled up list and added more features based on the advisory board perspective and the higher level perspective that the steering committee members might have. And then finally, they undertook the very daunting task of looking through all those features and ranking them by each of the member companies. And then we came up with a final ranking of those 170 some features, and wanted to share with you the top 10 feature list for for 2020. That should be 2021. That's a typo. So, and in some cases, I grouped some features together. You guys have access to the feature list as we created it at the expert group level. And so basically the top priority from the steering committee was Flutter. I have a couple slides on Flutter a little later on, but Flutter is a UI toolkit that was developed by Google, and is now being for Android, and is now being pushed more and more into embedded systems. The next couple sets of features were virtualization based for our virtualization expert group, Virt.io, and creating a common device interface. Then reference hardware. We have a reference hardware expert group. In the past they've created a reference hardware, that IVI reference hardware that was built by Panasonic, and coming up with the next iteration of that reference hardware, which is really to possibly replace one of the boards, the system on chip board, and upgrade the processor for that. But they're really deciding what the next step of the evolution of the reference hardware is. Then Instrument Cluster has a DRM sharing feature that was worked on last year by AGL, and they want to extend that feature a little bit more this year. A couple of the number 6 and number 11 both are related to app framework and the evolution of the app framework, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Then a couple more features from the IVI expert group related to policy management and creating the production ready spec. And then a couple of vehicle to cloud topics, identity management, and creating some telematics demos. So that's kind of the top 10 list. There were a lot of other features. Just because your favorite feature didn't make the list doesn't mean you can't work on it. We're an open source project. Anybody can contribute any code that they would like. We're completely transparent in that respect. And a lot of times we do get, not a lot of times, but we very often get features that are submitted, new features that are submitted by individuals or member companies who are interested in a particular topic. And we review everything, and we try to include as much as we can in the distribution in the UCB. So the car of the future. So as we've been going through, especially the product ready IVI expert group, but also some of the newer expert groups, I like to think about, the future, the car of the future, and thinking about, model year 2027 or 2030. So we're talking, 5 to almost 10 years out there. And what will vehicles be capable of in that time frame? Will we have autonomous driving? Will we, the fleet will largely be the new car fleet will largely be electrified at that point, I would imagine. What features and applications do we want to enable? If you think about what cars had 5 or 10 years ago versus what they have today, I just bought a 2021 model car this year, and replaced that with replacing a 2012 model car, and boy, cars have evolved quite a bit in 10 years. All sorts of safety features and in-vehicle infotainment, systems that didn't really even exist in 2012. What's the vehicle topology? We've talked about in some of the expert groups. Is it centralized or decentralized processing? Do we have a lot of ECUs? Do we have one great big computer controlling the whole thing? What SOCs are being used? And you want to know, I've thought long and hard about this, and you want to know what the answer is? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but we're here to figure it out. I personally have a lousy track record in foretelling the future. I would have told you, in fact, I did say back in 2007, 2008, when I was working on mobile phones and somebody showed me Twitter, I said, who would ever want to do that, right? That's going nowhere. So don't ask me to predict the future. So here's how we're going to figure it out. We have a lot of expert groups, and these guys, I like to say you don't need to be an expert to work in an expert group, and I certainly am not an expert in anything. Just ask my wife. And so we have all these expert groups, and they're looking at what the vehicle of the future is about. And we have this new expert group here called Containers and Service Mesh, and they're really interested in this vehicle topology question, and how do we move services around from centralized to decentralized architectures. And the vehicle to cloud guys are looking at, you know, how as bandwidth becomes ubiquitous, what that means to the vehicle. Reference hardware. What does the hardware of the future look like? So we have all these expert groups doing all these wonderful things. And I see that AGL over the next, few years will continue to evolve to embrace more of the best of open source. I think we need to do a better job of taking advantage of upstream. I think one of the lessons that we've learned over the last few years is we can't, the automotive industry can't take on some of these big projects like functional safety, like creating a brand new application framework from scratch. We just don't have the resources, and these problems are much bigger than just what's out there in the automotive industry. So let's work with existing communities to extend their open source software to enable automotive use cases. And communities that we've worked with so far, like Wire Plumber and Pipewire and Wire Plumber, they've been very receptive to these ideas. Yocto and Open Embedded, again, very receptive to a lot of the requirements that we've had coming out of the automotive industry, especially for configuration and BSP management and things like that. We have kind of a homegrown application framework that evolved out of an old version of Tizen. Well, in the time that we've been doing that, the systemd community has moved they've moved forward quite a bit and evolved quite a bit. So how do we take some of those mature technologies and replace the application framework? Weston and Wayland have evolved considerably, and we've made done a lot of effort on the AGL compositor. And then Flutter, how do we take Flutter from the existing community that's using it quite a bit and has really shown some really cool applications with it, and get that into AGL? So topology, the system on chips, the SoCs, they continue to grow ever more cheaper and more powerful. It's amazing what we see, being pushed into cars, to both today and in what's being talked about for the vehicles of the future, coming from a number of different silicon vendors. Next 5-10 years, high-speed connectivity becomes more and more ubiquitous throughout the world, not just in the United States. How can we then use both of those facts to rearrange some of the functionality within the vehicle? How do we move maybe some of that functionality to the cloud? How do we move it back? Depending on, if you're selling a vehicle in a country with less connectivity, maybe you have the ability to move you have the requirement to move some of that back on board. So the virtualization, the container, and the new service mesh, container and service mesh expert group, and the vehicle to cloud expert groups, they're all tackling this. And here's the good news. They're all going to tell you today about what their great ideas are and how you can participate in those futures. Pay attention to what those guys have to say. You got some really smart people who are working on this stuff. In terms of, we talked about build tools and working with Yocto. Jan Simon will have an update on, as part of his CIOT update, how we're working with Yocto, how we're working with Elisa will come from the instrument cluster expert group with functional safety. So we'll have an update there. And see, like I said, with Jan Simon, CI and testing to pull all of this together, pull it all together, make sure it works. We'll have a great presentation from Thomas Walter on vehicle simulation and how we can take the work that he's done at Rutgers University and expand that, and enable more and more people to be able to test AGL and applications. So the product ready IVI expert group. So this is an expert group really being led by Toyota. And the idea is, how do we take some of the production components that are already being used by our OEMs and our tier ones and bring those into the vehicle. But at the same time, adapt those to the evolving framework of the AGL UCB. So basically, they're focusing on, what are the key features needed by future IVI systems that are in development today for the model years, 5 years in the future. They have done, and they'll continue to do, gap analysis, feature gap analysis between the current UCB and what is needed in the cars of the future, and then encourage more code reuse from existing production systems and encourage more donations from OEMs and tier ones. We've had a number of those in the last few years, including RBA from Denso and Addit, a number of components that were donated by Toyota, all sorts of different things that are available out there that we've been asking for donations for. And then using that feature gap analysis and the requirements that are being developed by Toyota and the expert group to continue to evolve the AGL application framework. And Daniel Stone in a little bit will have a discussion about some of the ideas for evolution of the application framework in the next year or two. Flutter. So what is Flutter? If you haven't heard of Flutter, it's an open source user UI toolkit created by Google originally for Android. It enables cross-platform development. So I think, one of the issues I see the automotive industry faces and has faced in the last few years is there's really just a finite number of embedded developers out there. How do we bring more embedded developers into the fold? How do we lower the barrier to entry for embedded development? Well, one idea is by having Flutter, which enables cross-platform development, you isolate some of the embeddedness of the vehicle and have Flutter basically acting as this sandbox. And then we'll be talking about service mesh and containerization and using some of that technology to also remove some of the embeddedness of the vehicle environment and enable more and more people to join the embedded revolution here in the vehicle. So right now we see Toyota is working to open source their implementation. They have a Flutter embedder that works with Wayland. There's another one out there that we've engaged with Sony to look at their Flutter embedder. But Toyota is still in the process of some of Toyota's code is already available on GitHub. They're in the process of figuring out what more they can disclose. And then in the meantime, as kind of a risk mitigation, Gali has been working on running Flutter apps using the existing UCB by running Flutter on top of Web App Manager. So having Flutter uses a language called Dart. By having a Dart to JavaScript shim layer, basically Gali is able to run they've been able to port some of the AGL reference applications to a Flutter environment. And hopefully we could later on use, because it's the whole idea of cross-platform development, we'll be able to reuse some of those apps as we move into a more direct Flutter embedded environment. So we've got a Confluence page. I've got a link to the Confluence page here in the slides, so you can watch this continued evolution over the next few months and years. Also, as Toyota determines what they can open source, you again continue to watch that evolution. The Product Ready IVI expert group meets every 2 weeks on Thursdays at noon UTC. I'll let you do the conversion to your local time. That's 7 a.m. Chicago. And the next meeting is August 5th. We're going to skip the next 2-week session would have been July 22nd, but I think that's a Japanese holiday, so we're taking that week off. So really, I encourage you, if you're interested in IVI and the future of IVI, to join the IVI Production Readiness Expert Group. Really, it's a great opportunity to help drive these requirements as we create a product-ready IVI spec. That was one of the top priorities from the steering committee. As we drive that spec and figure out what features need to be in AGL in the future, and then basically help us and maybe contribute some of the code as we go along here in the next few years. So that was it for my slides, and I'll throw it back to Dan.